Hi there, everybody. This is Chris Schmidt, and welcome to the Introduction to Transform 1.2 training. This part of the series is going to be focusing more on the technical aspects of Transform, kind of clicking on every single button. So, I assume that you've just installed Transform. So, how do you use Transform? Well, the basics of Transform is you need some piece of geometry, and that can be whatever you want. I've just got a simple scene here with some lights so that it looks a little more pretty. But we can throw in any geometry into it. So that might be text, it might be some primitive objects, it might be a model you've imported. The important thing to note is that the only thing that Transform takes in is the geometry and the textures. None of your animation is going to be fed into Transform. So all motion will come from Transform. So let's start out with a MoText object. And we'll just leave it super basic. Let's call this demo. And what do we do? Okay, so there's our geometry. What do we want to do with it? Well, we want to go to our plugin folder and we want to click on Transform. So the way you work Transform now is you take your geometry and you drop it as a child of Transform. So as soon as you drop that in, then it's going to say click refresh. So make sure you grab Transform. It does require a single refresh. So right here we got this arrow pointing to the refresh button. All we have to do is click that, and now your object is part of Transform. You'll see that there's automatically a bounding box put around it, and it should completely encompass your geometry. And for the most part, those are the basics. That's the basics of Transform. Now it's functioning. So you should be able to just hit the play button, and now you will get motion. So that is using MoText. But next up, let's do something like, we'll just do something simple, create a cube. And I'm going to make the subdivisions 10 by 10 by 10. And actually, let's change our camera mode so that we can see those polys. And we're going to take that and throw it into Transform. Now, this is yelling at us and saying this is not a cloner object. And that's because the previous object we had put in was a cloner object, so it can't be in that mode. So now we go to mode, and we're going to change that to something like chunk or poly in this instance. So let's go to chunk mode. What chunk mode does, of course, is it breaks this object apart into random chunks. Now, the important thing to note is that Transform is based off the object's original geometry. It can only chop apart what you feed it. So you can see the way the chunks look here. Now, Transform itself does not create additional geometry. So what that means is if you want this to be smaller chunks or pointier or triangulated or wherever the case may be, you have to go and change that back in your original object. If you're going to work with your original object, I suggest turning off Transform, and now you're seeing your original object without it kind of being affected. Now we could say increase the geometry a whole bunch, set these up to 25, turn it back on again, refresh it again, and now we'll have smaller chunks of tinier detail. So next up, what if you want to feed it multiple objects? Well, you can put your objects into a null. Only the first object in the hierarchy is going to be affected. So let's say we have a cube and the sphere. So I can move the sphere over here so they don't overlap. And let's make both of them children of the null. I'm going to grab that and throw it into Transform. And now we can click refresh, and now both of those objects are going to be included in a single object. So as many objects as you want to put in a null, you can do it that way. You can, at any given point, have multiple transforms in your scene. So for instance, this one is going to be animating out. So we can have this copy of it and have it animate in. And let's see, the one that we're animating in, why don't we rearrange it? Now, here's an important note. If I scoot the cube this way, you're not going to see it. Because the transform is completely taking it over, we have to turn off the transform in order to see our geometry. So what I've done is on one transform, we have a sphere and a cube, and on the second, we have the cube and the sphere. So I'm going to turn this one back on, and the only thing we've changed is this one is animating in and the other is animating out. So we're starting out with a cube and a sphere, and I hit play, and one transform is animating in, the other is animating out. So by the end of the animation, it looks like they swapped places, even though those two transforms are completely unrelated. So yeah, so those are the important points. Make sure you turn off transform if you're changing base geometry. You have to edit all of your geometry in your original objects. And I think that'll cover it for this basic video. Hi there, Chris Schmidt here, and welcome to the Introduction to Transform 1.2 training. So in this video, in the series of more technical videos for Transform, we are going to be going over the Transform tab. So all the buttons involved in the basic tab here. So I guess we'll just get started. So I'm going to start out by creating a piece of geometry, say MoText, and we'll call it demo, and we'll center it, and maybe we'll make our font a little nicer. Helvetica. Can't go wrong with Helvetica. And let's go a little further. Let's give it a fillet cap so it gets a little bit rounded. And I'm going to make it white. And also, I did change my camera view so that we're on shaded lines so we can see our geometry. So, of course, the basics are you take your object and you make it a child of transform, and then you hit refresh. So, what are we looking at here? Make sure I'm rewound all the way. So what are we looking at here? Well, we just fed in a MoText object, and Transform is smart. If you feed it a MoGraph object, if you feed it a cloner or a matrix object or a fracture or a MoText, it knows that it is a MoGraph-based object, and you can animate it that way. So we'll actually we'll be talking about that a little bit. But it automatically detected it was a cloner-based object, and so it put it into cloner mode. So, what do we have here? Well, of course, the first buttons are preview, which will speed everything up if you were using something like thickness. Then it'll turn that off temporarily, and then at render time, you can turn it back on again. Right here, we have feedback. This is giving us some information based on the object that we're feeding it. So this is not an object that's been made edible and we're in cloner mode, so that's not too relevant for this particular one. What's next? Well, next is really important. Next is full update and refresh. So pretty often, actually I think almost all the time, Transform will prompt you to do a refresh. But doing a full update is important for whenever you change your geometry. And the most basic idea here is whenever your bounding box changes, you need to do a full update. So if I were to change this word, let's just put an exclamation mark at the end. You see my bounding box is no longer capturing this object, which means it's not going to animate properly. So I have to do a full update, and it prompts me to refresh, and now you see the bounding box is properly grabbing the object again. Refresh is important for updating textures. That depends on what mode we're in. Like right now, if I change this, it'll instantly change. But if we were, say, in chunk mode, I'm going to refresh, and now we're in chunk mode. If I change my material, the object will not update until we do a refresh. We didn't have to do a full refresh because we weren't changing the bounding box. But, yeah, so we have to do that. So what is up next? Well, next, pretty important, is our mode. So we've got a couple different modes here. We've got chunk mode, poly mode, cloner mode, and existing parts mode. And we can do all of those in this particular, with this particular object. So let's start from the top. Chunk mode. Chunk mode will randomly split apart our object based on its geometry into multiple chunks. So, as I scrub through here, you're going to see that the object breaks apart, and every one of these parts has multiple polygons. Like right here, you can see there's a nice cluster of polygons here. Every once in a while, you'll have smaller clumps where there's leftover pieces, but it's randomly breaking it apart in chunks. One of the most important settings when using chunk mode is going to be chunk size right here. As I increase the chunk size, then these pieces in general will be much larger pieces. And as I decrease it, we can start getting smaller chunks put together. Now, there's a problem here, and that is our MoText isn't very evenly subdivided. You see, like, we get these tiny little polygons here, but right here, that's one giant polygon. It's not very evenly subdivided. So that problem is solved using our other plugin that came with Transform, SuperText, but I don't want to get into that too much right now. So perhaps we can just fix our basic geometry. We'll talk about SuperText separately. We'll fix our basic geometry by changing this to subdivided. Actually, subdivided is not going to, well, it might. Let's give it a go. I'm going to change that just to the MoText to subdivided, and I'm going to do a refresh on our transform, and now we see we have a lot more geometry. So now we might see a little more clearly in chunk mode how it's a little more even now, and now we get these nice even chunks. So that's chunk mode. Next up is poly mode, and poly mode is brand new to Transform 1.2. And when you click on that, and then you do a refresh, then what happens is it splits apart every single polygon. Let's change, well, I don't want to change it yet. But you see that they aren't combined anymore. Every single individual polygon is going to split apart and do their own animation. So that is poly mode. Next up is cloner mode. Let's go back there and hit refresh. What's cool about cloner mode is transform isn't creating a copy of the geometry anymore. It's actually feeding the transform animation directly into the mode text. So we're just straight up viewing the mode text geometry. So you see that we get this we get a letter by letter animation, and this is actually a special setting when you put in a mode text. When you put in a mode text, you'll see we get a mode text target, and right now it's targeting the individual letters. Let's change our words a little bit here. We'll say, hello, C40 peeps. All right. So we've changed the geometry, so we have to do a full update. So I'm going to say full update, refresh. So this is every letter is being affected. Next, we can say, well, let's do it in order. Words. Next will be words. So now it's word by word they're being affected. So you see hello moves as a unit, peeps moves as a unit, and C4D moves. And then we have lines, which will actually be this entire line is going to move as a unit. If in the mode text we copied this and pasted it a few times, and of course a refresh because we changed our geometry, changed our bounding box. Now because it's based on the lines, each individual line will become a unit. If we go back to words, each one of those words is its own unit. And then of course it'll just be one single giant unit. Don't use that one too often. Not very interesting. So that's cloner mode. And then lastly, let's simplify this again. Might be a little long. Do another refresh. Lastly, in mode, we have existing parts. So what this will do is break apart the geometry into each of its individual polygon groups. So if I turn that on, we hit refresh, what will happen as I drag this around is you'll see that these letters are splitting apart into their individual components. So right here we have the rounding, here's the face, here's the edge, and on the back side you can see the other rounding and the other face. It's splitting those all apart, and that's because each of those were not already welded together. In mode text, if you were to make it editable, those are not connected, so they're each treated as their own individual part. So that's pretty cool. I mean, this is a cool look by itself. Like I like this, but maybe that's not what you want. And a way around that, if you were using mode text in existing parts mode, is you might, well, first of all, you should use super text, but the old way would have been make a connect object. And then we throw this in the connect object. The connect object is dynamically welding it together. And of course, now you have to fix the Phong. Set that down to 22. And now we can take that and throw that into transform and hit refresh. And now all the pieces are welded together, so now each letter is being animated. So, depending on the circumstance, that might very well be the way that you want to do it. Let's go back to what we had, get rid of the connect, and we'll refresh. So that is existing parts mode. Every existing part inside. And let me show you with a different object. I'm going to copy the mode text out, or move it out. And let's create a figure. The figure is made up of a whole bunch of individual parts. Like it's a single object, but transform will detect the individual parts. Right now it's yelling us because it's not a cloner, so let's turn it to its existing parts. And now we get our bounding box around the entire figure. But as I drag this, every unconnected part of his will move around because he's in existing parts mode. If we are in chunk mode, he'll just chunk up. You won't really be able to tell his existing parts as they were. And of course, polygon mode, every single polygon will split apart. So that is mode. Those are all the different modes we can put transform in. So what's up next? Well, next up is pretty straightforward. It's the transition. So what are we transitioning? We are transitioning out, which means at the time of 0, actually at the start frame, but yeah, at the time of 0, our object will be there. And by the end of the animation, which is 72, because we're running at 24 frames a second, it might say 90 for you. And by the end of the animation, he'll be completely gone. We're transitioning from there to transitioning out. So the only option here is to change it to reverse, to change it to in. We are animating in. So that means at the beginning, he's not there. And if we hit play, he will animate in. So transition, pretty straightforward. I'm going to go back to out. All right, next up is probably the most important tab, the effect that we're doing. I'm going to throw our text back in. And hide the figure. And refresh. And I want to do chunk mode. Poly count too high. That's because I have this so low. Okay, cool. All right, so next up is the effects. Right now, our default effect is transform because transform is called transform. So if you click on this, and in your list, you might actually see more if we make more. These are all the pre-built effects that we've created. Now, certain effects look better in certain circumstances. For instance, you'll see that there's a whole new series called Poly. So these are built to work with Poly mode. They look particularly good with Poly mode, but they can be applied to anything. You can apply them. You can click on it and do it even if you're in, say, letter mode or in existing parts mode or something like that. I mean, there's really nothing to do but to try these. We have an animation. We should have an animation out of all of these and how they look. But every single one of these effects will give you a completely different animation. And the looks should be pretty drastically different. Like here's Collapse, where it looks like it falls down. And we've got something like, let's see, Rain. I think Rain 2 at the beginning. It's going to, actually, this one rains in. So we'd want to set that to animate in. So now what that should look like is we have these individual kind of chunks of polygons raining in and creating our object. Now, important things to note. Whenever we change, I'm going to drag this up a little bit. When we change our effect, it changes a lot of these parameters. Not all of them, but a lot of them. If you look down here, to especially say like the fall off and the randomness, every preset has what we thought was the best look for it. So if we went to Firework, let's say Firework 2, it's jumping around because I wasn't at the beginning. Firework 2, you'll see that my randomness dropped down to 0, my end scale is up at 100. These will automatically transition based on what the effect is calling for. But just because that's what the effect defaults it to doesn't mean that's what you have to keep it at. So here's another effect. It's Firework 2. Jumps up in the air and then poof. All right, so those are the effects. Now, like, just go ahead and play with them. Like, there's a ton of them. They all look pretty cool. We tried to make the best ones we could. But there's one in particular that's important, and we're not going to cover in this video, but it is custom at the very top. If you click on custom, it will actually open up your own tab. It'll open up a custom tab, and in this tab, you'll be able to create your own effects. Anyway, let's go to a regular one. Let's go to Crystallize. I like Crystallize. So this one's going to kind of shoot out in all these different directions. And let's continue talking about some of our settings. Next up is orientation, and this might work a little better if we throw, actually let's create a cube and subdivide the cube a couple times. I'm going to throw that into here. I'm going to yank out my MoText. I should turn off Twitter. Okay, and then we're going to refresh. Actually, I want to go to poly mode, and I'll hit refresh. So here's what we got. We've got this animation happening. Now, the next setting we're talking about is orientation. So in the orientation, we are going to change the direction that the effect is applied. So right now it's set to X minus. It comes from X minus. So you'll see that it transitions from the left and goes to the right. But we could change this to X plus, or it was already on X minus, so let's go to X plus, and now you see it transitions the opposite direction. And then everything's pretty straightforward from here. You can do Y plus, and that'll travel up on Y. You do Y minus, and you can do Z, so it'll come from front to back. And then we have uniform random. So what this is how, well, it's applying it to the entire thing at the same time. So you see the entire thing is affected. And the reason it also has the word random in there is now the randomness setting is very important. If we have 0 randomness, all of them will transition at the exact same time. Excuse me. All of those will transition at the exact same time. But if we increase the randomness a whole bunch, now you'll see that they start randomly popping out. And the further you go, the more random that will be. You can add just a little bit of randomness. And now they all move out almost together, but not quite. So that's uniform random. Next up would be shader. And if you turn that on, it'll actually create a shader tab. And there's going to be a whole video about using shader fall, so we're not going to talk about it here. But you can actually affect the way it falls off based on a shader and not based on X, Y, or Z. So let's go back to maybe X plus and continue forward. So I'm going to, let's go to chunk mode now. And we can talk about thickness. And let's go to not crystallize. Let's go to dissolve. I like dissolve. So this is what dissolve looks like. It kind of fades upward and each individual chunk fades away. Now you see by default, the chunks have, I mean, these, chunk mode has no thickness. None of these modes have any thickness. It's just the existing geometry. But with thickness, we can actually drag in some thickness. So depending on your geometry, you might have to go negative, you might have to go positive. In this particular instance, we want to go negative, and you see it gives us a little bit of thickness onto the inside. So now when they come apart, they will have some thickness. Now, depending on your geometry, you might have geometry that is not very well set up to have thickness applied to it, so they might start intersecting. There is potential problems there depending on the geometry that you're using. In addition to that, when you give your object thickness, actually weld is in chunk mode. Okay, we'll get to that. So that you can give that thickness, and you can also give poly mode thickness. If I refresh, you'll see we can give our individual polygons thickness. Those are the only two modes where thickness appears. So if I go to existing parts mode, actually I guess it will have thickness in existing parts, but you won't see it because it's the entire object. So it wouldn't make sense to use it there. Although if it's a thin object, you could potentially want to add thickness there, which is why it is there. For instance, let me just give you a quick for instance. If we had this flat plane, I can throw that flat plane into transform, and we're in existing, well, I guess it wouldn't be existing parts mode. It could be a whole series of flat letters. Yeah. Well, in any case, this is neat. I'll just point out here. We've got this plane in here, but now we can give that plane thickness. So even though it's a flat object, now transform's only animating a very small number of polys, but we have the thickness being applied afterwards. So that's pretty cool. Throw my cube back in there, turn it back on. Okay, so that is thickness. Next up is pre-effectors and post-effectors. Those are going to have their own video. But the basics are when you turn on pre-effectors, it's going to create a tab, and you can drag effectors in there. And these effectors, these MoGraph effectors, will affect the animation in the pre-effector before the transform animation happens. And if you turn on post-effectors, you'll get another tab, and these post-effectors happen after the transform animation. So next up, we have a new setting called Animate. And Animate we did because of our upcoming plugin called Signal. And if you turn out right now, you see our animation happens from 0 to 72. Yours is probably 0 to 90. But if you turn on the Animate checkbox, the time goes away, and instead we are left with an Animate slider. So we can actually animate this however we like through the slider. So we can actually keyframe that. And with Signal, you could drive the animation that way as well. So for instance, if you wanted your animation, like right here, the cube is here, we actually animate the cube out at a keyframe and then animate it back in again with a single transform. So I think that's going to really make transform a lot more powerful. So what is next? Let's turn that off, go back to regular. Next would be the start frame and end frame. This is when the animation starts. So if I were to say start this at frame 25, nothing will happen until frame 25, and then it'll transition out. So that works pretty well. Next up and now we're in our movement dropdown. You can always have that collapse if you don't want to be viewing it. But next up is the movement slider. So what the movement and rotation are both multipliers on top of the effects. So you'll see that this is transitioning out, and you see that our pieces are floating away. But this is for all purposes totally arbitrary. We build everything assuming that you're kind of working at this default scale. But if this was a really tiny cube, and let's go ahead and refresh, and if I zoom up to about the same amount, you'll see that it looks like the effect is happening a lot more. That's because they're moving in an absolute amount of distance. So I'm going to hit undo, and let's get the big cube back. So anyway, the point here being, the movement is a multiplier on top of whatever effect that you're on. So for instance, we could drag this up higher, and you'll see that these are floating further away. It's the same effect, but they're going to move further. Or you can drag it all the way down to 0, or even negative, actually, and they'll go the opposite direction. But if you move it to 0, then it'll still do its scaling and rotating. Yeah, scaling and rotating, but it won't be moving at all. So every effect, this can have drastically different looks. Like every single effect in Transform can look completely different if you start moving just these couple of sliders. So we're in Transform mode, and you see these are all kind of flipping around and doing a little transform type animation. But this can look drastically different if we drag our movement down to 0. Now, though they're not moving at all, and they're just randomly rotate. This is almost a completely different looking effect. We could then, our rotation, we could set to maybe 180 degrees. Now they're going to flip all the way, and now we have another completely different looking effect. Maybe we could just do a little bit of movement, and you can still see them flipping around a whole bunch. Or we can add a whole bunch of movement and get rid of the rotation entirely. So now you see they just all fly out, but they never rotate. Now these two settings are very dependent on the effect that you're in. If I go and set this to, say, disintegrate, these will automatically reset to the defaults. Most of them should be probably at 190 degrees as a multiplier. And then you see dissolve is a little bit different. But like even with dissolve, now I can say fly way out. So now they're dissolving further away. And they can have a lot more rotation, or maybe just a little dissolve. So now they're flipping around a bunch, but not moving very far. All right, cool. Set those back to default. Next up is end scale. And depending on what you're doing, especially with text, you might want to keep your end scale. So right now it's saying scale to 0. But if we drag this up, then as the transition happens, the polygons won't shrink to 0. And if we go to chunk mode, hit refresh, our chunks will remain. You see that they just hang around. If we were to drag that down to 0, then you see they scale, almost every effect scales out over the course of the animation. But end scale can stop that from happening. Let's go back to polygon mode so that we can view this a little better. And let's go ahead and change it over to the figure, actually. A little more interesting. We got the figure. Actually, I'm going to increase his number of segments so we have more polys to work with. I'm going to set him to poly mode and do a full refresh and hide the cube. So, and rewind all the way. Got to make sure you wound, otherwise the animation's already happened. So it's great too, is Transform is calculating in real time. You don't need to like rewind all the way. Like as soon as it transitions, like we can just jump anywhere in the timeline. It's automatically exactly what that animation should look like. So anyway, what is next? Next up is fall off. So here's a good example actually. Right now we're using disintegrate, and you'll see it's coming from X plus, so it's transitioning in from that direction and it fades across. What fall off does is it kind of pinches the, what's a good way of putting it? There's a transition from one side to the other, and as our fall off gets smaller, it's how quickly does that animation happen. So you'll see that now it's really tiny. You see that the arms almost completely disappeared before it ever gets to the body. But if we have a really big fall off, then it's going to start it's kind of spreads out the effect. The effect will actually kind of look like it's happening slower to any given piece. Well, it is happening slower, but you'll see that as this animation transitions, that the arm is still completely there and it's almost passed through the entire body. So a big fall off will make almost your entire object look like it's being affected. It's still, you can still see like the last parts are over here. And a tiny fall off will make it so that any individual piece's animation is happening very quickly, but it'll disappear before it gets further along. So fall off is very, very useful. And once again, can completely change the way your animation looks. For instance, let's go to back to transform. Blind transform and chunk mode. So now we've got our animation here, transform. But if we go and we set our fall off to be really tiny, you'll see a very different feeling effect. And if we crank it way up, say at like 1,000, the entire figure is going to be animating pretty much at the same time. There's barely any of that transition. So fall off, really important for these animations. All right, next up, let's go back to poly mode. This will show this off a little better, but all of these settings are applicable to all of these. Back in poly mode, we are going to tinker with, let's go back to dissolve. I think dissolve is just a good one for showing off some of these effects. Actually, disintegrate's a little more fun. Okay, so that next up is randomness, and that is kind of like the random variation in that fall off. So for instance, if we drag the randomness all the way down, and let's zoom up on this arm a bit, you'll see that the effect is very evenly traveling through the figure. Like right here, all of these polygons all start being affected at pretty much the exact same time because they're all even. But as we start dragging up our randomness, they'll start breaking down a little bit differently. So now you see as this transitions in, those don't all break at the same time. One's already transitioning. As we keep going, some of them still haven't gone out. So it can add some nice randomness to the way the effect is being applied to any given polygon. So we actually crank that really high up. If we crank that up to, say, 200, as we animate in, random polygons are starting to fly away even way further into the object. And it can, can have a really big effect that way. And of course, it's still at the beginning, it looks normal. At the end, it's completely gone. So it's just how is this animation passing through this object? In addition, there's a random seed for how this randomness is applied. So, like, I often like a pretty decent sized fall off and a little bit of randomness just so it's not quite so perfect. So, pretty cool. I like that a lot. The last setting, there's I guess I might have missed one, and that is do we have to give thickness? Or maybe it's just chunk mode. Okay, yeah. In chunk mode, if you turn on chunk mode, we should have talked about this actually. In chunk mode, there's a couple of chunk mode settings, and let's take a look at some of them. First of all, there's the chunk size, and that's kind of like the average number of polygons that will be involved in any given chunk. Like there will be leftovers, so it's not perfect. And this should refresh pretty quickly. As we go lower, the chunk size will be smaller. As we go higher, the chunks will be bigger. And actually, in some of these, almost like the head only breaks apart in like 2 or 3 pieces because the chunk size is so big. Next up is the variation. Like, how much variation do you want there to be in those chunks? So, like, even though they're not all perfect, as we start increasing this, then we're going to start ending up with bigger chunks and then more tiny chunks. So that's what the variation does. And then lastly is the weld checkbox. Now, certain textures can get messed up depending on the way they're mapped, so it's even noted here. But where this one might be important is if we were to, say, create a sphere, and I'm going to throw that in here. Let's make these relatively small chunks. If I rewind all the way, and hide this, if I hit render, you'll see that we can actually see the faceting. We can see the faceting from where it broke apart in chunk mode. If you turn on weld, it'll weld those back together, and when I hit render, it looks correct. So as I pull this out, and we've got thickness as well, as they break apart, they'll still break apart, but when we render here, you'll see that they're all welded together, so it creates a smooth object. Okay, so those were the ones we missed. Lastly is our time remap. I'm going to go ahead and throw our cube back in there. Oops. Misclicking. So we've got our cube, turn the cube on. Let's do a full refresh and get rid of our thickness because we don't need that right now. Oh, and if we did have some thickness, that's what turning on preview mode does. It makes it so the thickness isn't running. Anyway, I'm not sure if it does anything else actually, but it is useful because thickness can really slow you down. Like it adds a lot of calculation on top of everything else. So the last setting is time remap. So what this does is actually, it's a way of remapping the start time and end time. So if we were to, say, drag this into the halfway point, by the time we get to the halfway point of our timeline, our animation's already done. And then it's just a flat line after that. But we can do more interesting things than that. We can maybe select, let's go to polygon mode. We'll see this a little better. Poly mode. Okay, so now we've got our polygons transitioning from one to the other, but you see it's transitioning very evenly. We could maybe select these points and then go to soft, and now I can pull these out, and you can see what we've done is it says it should start out slow, go fast in the middle, and then level out in the end. So now we rewind, hit play, it's going to go slow, and then fast, and then slow at the end. So this is kind of the way it transitions. Instead of controlling it through keyframes, if we go to animate mode, we can do the time remap. So that is the longest one of these videos for sure, but those are all the basic settings for the main engine of Transform. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye. Hi there everybody, Chris Schmidt back with the next part of the Transform 1.2 tutorial series. So what do we got here? We're going to be talking about the pre-effector and the post-effector tab. So what's the setup I got here? I've got a sphere, and I'm cloning onto the surface of the sphere smaller spheres. So that's the setup, just something a little bit different. So what are we going to do? We're going to create the transform out of the plugins menu and drop the cloner inside of transform. Grab transform, I'm going to do a full update, hit refresh, and now I get my bounding box around here, which means it's ready for animation. I can drag this across and you'll see we get our animation. Oh, and I already set that. Let's go back to 90. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to click on transform, and I'm going to go to the pre-effectors checkbox, which is right underneath thickness. So I'm going to turn that on, and that's going to create a pre-effectors tab. So what this does is it allows us to add effectors in that will affect transform's animation, but they take priority over transform. The post effectors take place after transform is animating them. So how might we add one? Let's just well, first of all, let's add more frames. I'm going to set this up to say 300. And we're going to go to MoGraph. I'm going to create a random effector. So the way we apply this is we're going to click on transform, drag the random effector into the pre-effectors tab, and add that in. And you're immediately going to see it be affected. And that's because this random effector is taking place before anything that transform does. Now let's go to transform and go to the transform tab, and we don't want this animation to start right away. Let's say we don't want this to start until frame 90. It's going to start at 90 and end at 180. So we've pushed everything back 90 frames. So we have 90 frames to play with this random effector. So let's do something pretty straightforward. Let's just kind of have these all flown in random directions. So just increase this a bunch, and now they're kind of floating around. We can even go to our effector tab here, change the random mode to say noise, and now we could even hit play, and you'll see that they'll all be flying around based solely on this random effector. Transform's not doing anything until we get to frame 90. But here is what is very important to note about pre-effectors. Transform can only affect things properly that are inside of its bounding box. That's where it's assuming all the different pieces are. So any of these pre-effectors, we want their effect to be done by the time transform is beginning. I guess there might be some nuances there of other things you might be able to do, but this might start looking a little weird if I keep dragging through. You see it's constantly still flying around, it's being applied, and then they'll just kind of shrink away. But we didn't have too much control over that one. Now, what effect are we on? We are still on the transform effect. Let's go to something a little different, maybe. Let's go to dissolve. I'm going to turn off the random effector for a second so we can see what's happening without it. So we've got no animation, and then they just kind of all float up and disappear. We turn the random effect on. Then now they're going to be flying around randomly. And then as it gets into our animation, they're going to start scaling away to 0 and moving up, even though it's going to be kind of hard to tell. Now, it seems to work pretty well, but you'll see even as we get beyond 180, you see we're getting these little flashes of our different parts moving around still, and that's because they're passing outside the bounding box. So they're kind of coming back into existence. So what we might want to do is have this animation finish before what we want transform to do. So let's see, what might we want to do? Let's just go to the random effector, and let's go to frame, say 90. At the frame of 90, we want this to be drained down to 0. I'm going to rewind back to 0, and at 0, we want it to be up to 100%. So what's happening is it's animating all randomly, and then kind of going back to their original position over time. And then it's kind of, now they're where they belong, right in time for transform to take over. Now that could actually overlap a little bit. We could actually pull that further along, and they'll still be wiggling as transform's taking over. But by the end of transform, all their wiggling will be done, and thus the end state of transform will be there properly. We could even drag that all the way to our ending frame. And as long as it ends by then, none of them will be flying out where they'll be reappearing. So now we get all this wiggle and our transform effect. So pretty straightforward. You want to make sure you are inside the bounding box for a pre-effector. And you can pile as many of those as you want in. They all take place before transform's effects. So a post-effector. Post-effect. So let's go back to transform. I'm going to turn off pre-effect. And that goes away. And let's turn on post-effects. So in our post effects, it works the exact same way. Whatever we throw in here will take place on all of these parts, but it won't take place until after Transform's done its effects. So what might we want this to do? Well, the animation we've got built in right now is these are all kind of dissolving away and upwards. Let's go to Transform and change a couple things. Let's say we want them to move up further, and I'm going to go to N scale and drag that up to 100%, which means they're not scaling away. They're just moving upward. So these all move up. In fact, let's have them move even further. There we go. So this is just what Transform's doing. From frame 90 to frame 180, that is what is happening. But now what we can do is make a post effect. And what should our post effect do? Let's have our post effect actually go to, say, a spline shape. I'm going to make a circle. And I guess we should probably move the circle up out of the fall off. But I'm going to move that over there. And now what we can do is perhaps, actually, I'm going to make this go even further. I'm going to go to movement and pull these even further. And now what we're going to do is create a spline effector. We're going to create a spline effector. And what the spline effector is going to do is tell all these different parts to apply to this spline. So now we can go to Transform and go to our post effectors and drop in the spline effector, and it's going to immediately take completely over. It is completely taken over because it's the last thing to happen. The last thing that happens is it says, oh, all you clones, go on to this circle. So you see that it's completely overridden everything that Transform's doing. But we can change it in a couple ways. First of all, we could go to our spline effector and drag in the strength parameter if we want to. But as an alternative, why don't we go to fall off? And I'm going to make a linear fall off. And I'm going to set this to, I think, Y minus? I'm not sure. I'm going to drag this up to, nope, I guess I want Y plus. Y plus. So now what's happening is anything that has passed, I'm sorry, Y minus was the correct one. Anything below it hasn't been affected. Anything above it has been. So what I'm going to do is move this above Transform. And if we go rewind a little bit. So this is before Transform takes over. As our clones move upward and pass through this fall off, it's going to take over. And you'll see that these now are animating up because of Transform, and then as they pass into the fall off of the spline effector, they're getting sucked into their final position over here. And it looks like a couple of the clones, it looks like we're not quite catching them all because this fall off's too big. So if I were to pull this down maybe a little smaller and pull it down, then they'll get sucked in properly. So that's what was happening there. So excellent. So that's a spline effector with using a fall off. Another good use of post effector, I'm going to delete both of those. So now these are flying upward. Another good use of post effector might be to put in a delay effector. So we can go and make a delay, and I'm going to grab Transform, grab delay, go to post effectors, drop that in. And what do we want this to do? Well, I always think the most fun one is spring. So we're going to turn spring on. I'm going to give us a little extra power here just so we can see it really clearly. And I'm going to make sure I go back to, actually, I'm going to go back to 0. Now, here's always a risk with the delay effector, which you've probably run into when you're using, say, regular MoGraph, is it has to refresh. It's delayed, so you have to give it some refresh frames. So I'm going to hit play, and we'll just let this play up through the timeline. But anyway, actually, let's show you what it looks like without. So without, this is what's happening. Every particle is just flying up and then hitting its final position. But if we jump back, turn our delay effector on, and we hit play, as it passes through the animation, they're going to accelerate upward, and as they hit their final destination, they're springing back and forth because of the delay effector in spring mode. We could put a whole bunch of spring in there. If I jump back, you see they're going to have to spring back to their original position, which of course is just something that the delay effector does. But now you see they fly up, and then they have a whole bunch of wiggle. So that is the basics of pre-effectors and post-effectors. Just remember that the delay effector can mess Transform with just like it might mess regular cloners up. But that should all work pretty well. This would work just as well in cloner mode or polygon mode. So yeah, that should do that. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye. Welcome back to Transform 1.2 training. So in this video, we are going to be talking about our new little free plugin that comes along with Transform called SuperText. And SuperText is primarily a tool for preparing text and splines for transform animations. Does have some uses outside of that, but we're not going to go too far into that. But anyway, let's get going. Let's start by maybe creating a motext. We're going to create a motext, and let's go and make it look a little prettier. Let's change it to a different font. I'll try Helvetica New, and I'll set it to bold, just so there's a little something going on there. So that looks all right. Let's set it to middle, and maybe we'll even add some caps. I'll do a fillet cap on both ends. We could say constrain it so it doesn't get too much bigger. I can shrink the radius a little bit. Okay, pretty straightforward, not bad looking. Let's add this white material on top of it. Oop, just the white one, thank you. Okay, now, if we go and change our display mode to, say, this line one here, then you can see all the polygons that this text is made out of. And you see that this E has a whole bunch of polygons on the edge, but none on the face. And, you know, all these other letters are very low poly, except for maybe the curves on the T. So, if we were to, say, create a transform and throw the motext in the transform, and right now it's in cloner mode, but let's say we want to break it apart into chunks, or even poly mode. Let's even do that. Let's go to poly mode. Hit refresh. We're now in poly mode, but you'll see, and transform does automatically get rid of the n-gon, so it does break these apart. But you can see that this is the geometry that transform has to work with. It only works from existing geometry. So you see this breaks apart, and you'll see because of the way the motext works by default, that this E has tons of tiny little slivers of polygons, but say the capital T only has these big old fat polygons, so there's no consistency across this object. So the way we solve this is with supertext. So I'm going to grab motext and drag it out. And turn off transform just for a little bit because we don't need to worry about that for a second. I'm going to go into our plugin folder and grab supertext. And now with supertext here, I'm going to grab our motext and drop it as a child of supertext. And you want to make sure that you move your materials onto supertext. Now, one of the first things that happens is supertext is automatically welding the caps on. If we were to actually throw this back in the transform without supertext, and we set this to existing parts mode, you'll see that as I drag this across, the face and the rounding and the edges are all separate objects. They are not welded together. So that's another thing that supertext does, is when we drop this in, it's automatically welding those together. I'm going to turn off transform and then throw that back in the supertext. But because it's welding the caps on, now it's relevant the Phong tag. So we have to click on the Phong tag and set that down to something lower, like 22. And now we'll see that we get rid of the extra rounding we were getting from having this bevel on the edges. Okay, so by default, supertext has it welded the caps, and it also is fixing our cubic projection mapping. So what's important about that is I'm going to go to Texture Kit real quick because it's a fast way of getting image-based material. I'm going to go to man-made or something. Oh, here, cardboard box with warnings. That'll work. So we've got this cardboard box material. If I were to throw that onto, I'm going to turn off supertext also. When you throw a material onto text, what happens by default is it's going to be set to UVW mapping. And that's going to be kind of ugly. If I go and hit render on that, you'll see that our edges are getting mapped, but they look really weird, and the faces don't have anything. So if you're anything like me, what you probably do to fix that is you go to projection and you set that to cubic, because of all the different modes, cubic is the one that looks the best quickest. So boom, cubic mode looking great. Only there is a problem sometimes with this, and you see it in particular when you're using transform because it's animating everything around. What that is I'm going to click on our motext and the material. I'm going to go to our texture mapping, and you can see with the texture mapping, that's what is essentially happening is anything kind of on the top is getting this frontal projection. Anything from the front, or this flat projection from the top. Anything on this front space has this flat projection. It's kind of projecting onto the front of it, and it's kind of doing that everywhere. But what's happening with the text, with this bevel, is we have this perfect 45-degree angle. And the perfect 45-degree angle means that it doesn't know if it should have this top or the front. So what will happen when it's animating, and possibly even if just your camera's animating, is you'll get a whole bunch of flicker on the edge where it's toggling between the different projections. So we fix that, and we fix it in a very simple way. I'm going to throw this material onto supertext and turn supertext on. The way we fix it is automatically correcting it with this checkbox, and that is if you go into your cubic map in your coordinates, you see it's automatically given it the tiniest bit of rotation. You won't be able to visually tell, but now this perfect 45-degree angle knows which projection it's supposed to have. So it does that automatically. So that's another feature of SuperText. I'm going to get rid of that cubic mapping because we don't need to worry about it for a little bit, and we want to deal with our polygons. So the next most important thing is subdivide. We have a checkbox here for subdivide. If we turn that on, then we're going to activate a whole bunch of additional settings. The instant I turn that on, you're going to see that has completely changed our geometry on the text. Our text shouldn't look any different, but we've now added a whole bunch of different subdivisions. So what's happening is we've kind of cubically subdivided the face and the edges. So now everything has a very similar subdivision. So if we were to put this inside of transform, turn transform back on, and maybe go back to chunk mode, hit refresh, actually no, we did polygon mode, so let's keep it consistent. Go to polygon mode. Now the T used to have a whole bunch of big polys, and the E had a whole bunch of little slivers, but now they're all broken apart in very even looking size polys. So this works just as well with chunk mode. If we didn't have very many polygons, the chunk mode wouldn't look very interesting. But if we go to chunk mode now, with it subdivided like this, we have all these more interesting chunk shapes. All right, cool. So I'm going to turn off transform again. Let's work just with MoText because we have a whole bunch of different settings here, and they do quite a few things and stylistically enable you to do some really neat stuff, especially with transform. So first up is subdivision size. That is how big these boxes are. So if we start pulling down, if we start getting really tiny, it could even start slowing you down in the initial refresh. So you see it gets subdivided there. But let's go back up to something somewhat reasonable, but you can go that low. So that's subdivision. How big is that that grid? And then next up is the angle. So this kind of deals with how the MoText is subdivided on the rounded edges. So as I drag this number up and down, actually let's have our grid really big so we can see this more clearly. So as I turn that up, now you can see as I increase or decrease our angle, it's how sharp of an angle on the turn here of these polygons does it have to be until it creates a new subdivision. So as we decrease this number, it's going to create more and more and more edges. And as we go up, it's going to start getting very blocky looking. If we were to, and you can see here that this is all happening parametrically. We have not destroyed our MoText. So we get all these really nice subdivisions. If we, I've cranked up our grid size, we crank up our angle size, and you see that we get like a low poly looking text. We've gotten this all subdivided, not terribly smooth. So we put that back up. I'm going to go back to our default. So I'm going to right click on both these and say reset the default. So there we go. Now I got our regular subdivisions back. What's next? Well, we have face. We can turn that off, and what's going to happen is it is not subdividing based on a grid anymore on the faces, but what is happening is getting rid of the n-gons, so you'll see all this triangulation. So this will be affected. Now when we increase and decrease our subdivisions, you can see we can go way up, and this is cleaning up all the polygons. It's getting very low poly. As we decrease it, we can start getting almost an edge-esque. You see as we decrease our angle here, like it's only increasing the number of edges on these curves. But if we have that be a large number and we start decreasing our subdivision size with face turned off, then it's going to start subdividing our edges a whole bunch of times evenly on both both on the curved letters and the straight ones. Now, once again, this is all parametric, so I can go back to our original MoText here, and I can say demo again, and it's automatically going to refresh with demo. Now, okay, there's a little thing here that's probably happening with the caps, which is a normal thing that happens outside of SuperText anyway. So we just want to find one that it's not particularly catching that, but I guess I'll leave it there because there's always a chance with these kind of subdivisions that will happen. So, okay, that's face. We can turn the face on and off. Next up is depth, and that is the depth getting subdivided as well? You can turn that on, or we'll turn it off, and now it doesn't subdivide it at all. In fact, you have control over it. If we went to back to our MoText, I could increase it manually to whatever I want. If we have it turned on, our SuperText takes it over. So it fixes the subdivisions right there. So next is triangles. If we turn right now, it's trying to do everything as square as possible, but sometimes the cubic subdivisions on the front and the edges don't match, so you will get some triangles on the edge. But if we turn on triangles, everything will get triangulated, including, which you can't get out of straight MoText, including these beveled edges get triangulated. So now we've got these really nice tiny triangles. And if we were to turn our transform back on and use chunk mode, now we can get some really nice jagged random pieces. So you see they're not so grid-like anymore. We get these nice jagged bites, and we can decrease our chunk size. So now we get tinier pieces, or we can increase our chunk size. Now we get bigger ones. But now we get all these nice even subdivisions, and everything just starts looking better. Okay, turning transform back off again, going back to supertext. What do we have next? Next is randomize, and that only turns on when triangulate or triangles is turned on. And what that does is randomly about half of these triangles will randomly rotate to the opposite angle. So you see when this turned off, we have a very even slicey grid. If we turn randomize on, then they start randomizing. And the seed here will randomly change which ones are rotating. So about half of them are rotating and on any given seed. So now if we turn transform on and we randomize that, then now we're going to get even more random looking chunks. We're going to get different bites of different angles, and it just makes it look less uniform. So that's the reason right there that we made supertext. And that's most of the checkboxes. But we've actually found that supertext can do a couple cool things outside of that. Well, I'm jumping around a bunch, but that's okay. I really like supertext. Stylistically, lots of different things you can do with it. For instance, well, I guess we already hit up a couple of those, but we can really make it look low poly by increasing our angle. So we've got a low poly looking text here, but that can be low poly looking in spite of whatever the original MoText is. If I turn off supertext, we can go to some crazy curvy font. I hope one loads. Brush script. There, so we get to this crazy curvy font. And look, supertext doesn't even do anything, and you get this weird window thing. I think that mainly happens because we are in our caps, we are constraining. That's what usually causes that. So if you turn off the constraint, then they'll fix those usually. If we turn supertext on, then you see we convert this into a low poly version of itself. And we can always go back to supertext and decrease our grid and start adding in these edges back in again and get to whatever degree we want. But now we've got a cool low poly version of this font, and it's still parametric. You didn't have to make it editable to get that. Okay. Everything that we've done with MoText can also be done with an extrude. I'm going to go ahead and create an extrude, and I'm going to create, let's see. Actually, just to make it more interesting, there's going to be a little time jump here, but I'm going to find the Grayscale Gorilla logo and pull that in. And here we go. Let's just clean this up a little bit. I'm going to actually grab, I think, just the head. I'm going to grab just the head here, and let's go back to our other file, and I'm going to drop this in. I'm even going to do reset PSR there, shrink it down, maybe even scale it up. Drop that inside the extrude, and now we've got just, normal old extruded logo out of Illustrator. We can turn on, like, some fillet caps. We can shrink that back down again. I like them being a little cleaner. And let's go ahead and take that and drop it into supertext. And right away you'll see all the settings that we had in supertext are applying straight through here. Like we've now got a low poly version of this logo. And we can go to supertext and I can start decreasing our subdivision size. And we're going to start getting our grid in and smoother edges. We can smooth out our edges, maybe set this down to 15, get our smooth edges back. We can set this grid as large or small as we want. And now we've got, and we want to fix our font to something smaller, like maybe 22 is my favorite number because it's fast to type. So there we go. Now we've got this feeding through supertext. And of course we can go back to transform. Let's go to poly mode this time and turn that on. And boom, now we've got we got these tiny polygons all evenly created, all dynamically done through supertext. And we can always go back and change our original object. Like, oh, that's not big enough. Let's shrink it down. Or, it's too big. Let's shrink it down. And you'll see our grid actually isn't scaling because that's controlled through supertext. Of course, with transform, you have to refresh it. But anyway, so that's that. Another thing that's kind of neat with supertext is you can throw multiple splines inside here. So I can maybe grab I'm going to shrink this. I'm going to grab this spline. I'm going to pull off the side. If we throw this into the extrude as well, they'll both become a part of it. And in fact, it's still alive and we can still wiggle this around. If you start intersecting, you're going to start getting weird things. Like just the way a normal extrude works, like if you put both of these and they start overlapping, you'll see it actually inverts the Grayscale Gorilla logo. And now we get, the opposite. So pretty interesting looking there. That's pretty cool. I like it. Okay, what is next? Okay, that's spline. Subdivisions all work the same way. Okay, let's talk about some cubic mapping and baking it. So I'm going to actually... Oh, let's just throw some text in here. I'm going to grab... We're going to grab some text and change it once again to a... Let's do Gotham. Okay, so we got Gotham, and we'll say super for super text. So we got that. I'm going to drag it down. I'm going to throw that into the extrude as well, and I see it gets subdivided, and that is ready to be fed in the transform if that's what you want to do. But let's do some texture stuff. I'm going to go back into Texture Kit, and let's grab out some sort of material. What's falling apart? That one seems good. So here's a broken down wall. Let's throw this onto super text, and I'm going to once again immediately set this to cubic. So now it's cubically mapped, and you see we get this really nice texture going on. We can move that, rotate it, do whatever we want. That'll all filter through super text. But this also is making it so we can filter the materials down through the hierarchy. So I can drag the white so it's, you know, overriding this because it's beyond it. But now I want this to apply to maybe just R1. That's just going to apply to this front edge. So this front edge is this white material. I can grab maybe the cardboard box one, drag it here, set this to cubic as well. And I'm going to tell this one I only want this to be applied to C1, which is the face. So now you see we can apply multiple materials all on top of each other. And it's all filtering through super text. But here's the important part. When you're using polygon mode in transform, it can't, polygon mode can't handle cubic mapping. It passes through. So if you want them to stick, then you have to do one more thing, and that is click the super bake button. So if you click bake, then what it does is it creates a polygon version of our object, and it actually does this inside of supertext. You can see in the hierarchy, but what it's done is it's converted. You see on our original object we get cubic mapping, and then that's regular, and then cubic. What it's done is it's grabbed ours and set these to UVW and created new UVW maps. So now the UVW mapping looks exactly like the cubic used to. And now if we were to go into transform and we're in poly mode and we refresh, now if we zoom up here as we drag this across, you'll see that the individual polygons are maintaining their texture even in poly mode or chunk mode. So that fixes all that. The other cool advantage, well, okay, so that's I'm gonna turn transform off, so that's baking it, but everything is still here in the hierarchy, you see. So if you want to go back and make changes, you can just hit clear cache. It gets rid of that model. It's just gone entirely. And you can go back to your original object and change whatever you want. So yeah, let's change that a little bit, and that's ready. And now we could rebake it if we have to, but you can always go back and re-edit your original object. The other thing that I found this to be useful for, which wasn't its original intent, but it totally works, is if you're sending this to somebody and they don't have a font you have. If you say Super Bake, they don't have this font, but they have this mesh now. Now, of course, I can't change that mesh, but that is effectively baked out and ready to be fed into Transform. I'm sure we're going to have some cool tutorials in the future of some other cool things that Supertext can do. Like there's a really cool way of making these vinyl looking balloons really easily and parametrically with Supertext. But my favorite part is getting all these subdivisions easily and quickly, and all of it is parametric. And it fixes a bunch of bugs that were in Motex, like the subdivisions didn't work properly and the cubic mapping, like little things like that. You don't have to worry about anymore. Supertext does them all for you. So hopefully that covered it for you guys. I will see you in the next video, or if this is the last video, then have fun using Transform. So, bye. Hi there, everybody. Chris Schmidt here, back with the next part of the Transform 1.2 update tutorial series. So we are going to be talking about the shader tab in this one. And I don't think people use the shader tab too often, and it can be a little hard to wrap your head around, but I think it's very powerful. And go ahead and create a transform and a plane, just a flat plane, because I think it'll be the easiest way of seeing this. So what do we need? We need a whole bunch of polygons. I'm going to set to 40 by 40. I'm going to take that, throw it inside transform, and we'll do it in poly mode so we can see how they're being affected directly. So right now it's just an animation. It's just the transform effect. Pretty straightforward. In fact, to be able to see this, why don't we go and set this to custom mode? And you just see right now it's pretty straightforward. It transitions from left to right, and it just goes up and it scales to 0. Well, I actually want it to not even move. I'm going to go to our custom tab, which we talked about in the previous video. I'm going to 0 that out. So now the only thing it does is transition every polygon to 0. No motion, no rotation. They just scale to 0. So right now, we were talking earlier about the orientations. Like we can have this go from top to bottom, left to right. Like if we pinch in our fall off, you can see how this is, how in this is a good example of how this is affecting the what the fall off does. And then we can make that pretty tight and then increase the randomness. You can see how that falls off. There's like, you get really cool looks just from scaling down to 0. Like that's a really cool way of this object disappearing. Look at that. It's gorgeous. Love it. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about the last setting in the orientation, and that is shader mode. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on shader mode, and it is going to create a fall off shader tab. You'll notice that our fall off and our randomness have disappeared because those settings don't make sense when you're using shader mode. So what shader mode does is it is how is it transitioning out based on a black and white image. So by default, we can set our texture projection here, and there's a couple different settings. A lot of these you don't want to see all the time, so you have to turn on some checkboxes. But I'm going to turn on preview shader. So now we can actually see the shader that would be driving this animation. So as I drag this, you're going to see, actually I can turn that back off again for a second. As soon as I turn on shader mode, as I drag this, you can see that it's not dissolving left to right or even top to bottom. It's dissolving on what looks like it's based off of what looks like noise. So if we turn on preview shader in shader fall off, we can actually see a preview of that very shader. Like this is what's making it disappear. Whatever is white disappears first, and whatever is black disappears last. So what can we do? Well, we can do a couple of things. We can invert it, and now the opposite's happening. Now black disappears first and the white last. And then we may even have to refresh. You have to refresh sometimes, but not that time. That's inverting. And then we have texture projection, and right now you see it's frontal. It's X, Y, so it's the X and the Y, which is this plane. If we were working with a three-dimensional object, it would determine the texture projection, because it's always flat. Anyway, so we don't have to worry about that, but you can do the other two. So if this was a sphere, you could have it dissolving on the top instead of the side. But what we're going to do now is initiate our custom shader mode. We turn that on, and we're going to get a shader tab here. And it's going to actually put in a preset one here. But you can actually see, based on our preview, what this should do. Anything that's white will go first. So as I drag this around, you're going to see our polygons are shrinking. I'm going to turn off our preview. And now you can see our polygons are disappearing in that order, and then they disappear. So we can actually put any shader in here that we want. Let's start out simple, and let's put in a gradient. And in the gradient, let's make it circular. So now there's a circular gradient. If we turn on preview shader, we'll be able to see it there. But we know what that looks like, so I'm going to hide it so we don't have to see it. And now, unlike all the other effects, now we can do whatever effect we want, and it's going to start from the outside and transition in. We could invert that, and now the opposite will happen. Now the inside will begin the effect, and it'll end on the outside. And there's tons of, like, just using this gradient is a really cool way of getting different effects. If we turn it on box, you can see we have a box dissolve. And then we can always add turbulence into it. And now there's going to be some random turbulence on top of that. So now it starts from the center, but you see it kind of cracks outward and spreads. We could, it's a good way of getting an angle on it. We could do the gradient, and I don't want the turbulence, but I do want a diagonal. So now what's going to happen is it's going to start from one corner and transition to the opposite corner. We can even go way crazier than that. We can go into the shader, and we can turn on a layer. We can make a layer shader, and now I can add two of them on top of each other. I can even make a copy of this gradient and then make this one circular. And now, how do we want these to combine? We can set these to overlay each other. So now look at this weird effect. Now, when we do it, now you're going to see it transitions from the light point to the dark point in a really weird kind of pattern. We would have that multiply. Well, not screen, multiply. So now you see it's going to transition from the center and this corner and spread that way. We can do even crazier things. I'm going to keep the circular one, put back to normal, and I'm going to go to noise. And maybe we can go to this noise and we can crank up the noise a little bit stronger, higher contrast. And it's pretty small, so let's set this up to like 500. So now we get this random noise. So actually the noise by itself works, but now we can overlay that on top of this one. So now we've got a circle, but there's some random noise on top of it. We can go crazier still. I can change this to normal, and now it's as if it's only the noise. And we go inside the noise, and I can make the noise animate. I can set the noise to 1, and now the noise is animating as the rest of our animations, which actually means parts of this animation could go backwards. They could come back in. It'll still be gone by the end. It'll still be entirely there at the beginning. But let's speed up our animation to 2, and now you might see some start going away. Like right here, you see this is starting to come in, but then as it animates away, well, I guess that particular spot isn't, but over here you can see like they're starting to transition in, but they're moving around. Where is black and where is white is constantly changing. So it is animating as it's moving out. And of course, like everything you do with shaders can be applied here. We could crank up our contrast all the way to black and white. Actually, that might not be so good because it's going to look a little weird as it's transitioning. We want a little bit of a transition. Let's get rid of our animation. But now it's entirely there, and it's going to, the contrast is so high, a big chunk will disappear, and then the other chunk will disappear because there isn't that much of a gray, and gray is where the transition happens. So instead of using this plane object, why don't we go and create a matrix object? It's just a faster way of doing a cloner, but I don't want to deal with that. So let's just create a matrix object. I'm going to set the 15 by 15 by 15, throw it inside transform, get rid of the plane, don't need it, full update, refresh, and now the bounding box is going to snap on in here. Now, unfortunately, the bounding box goes to the center of the clone, which is actually what we want, but it's making it harder to see the shader. But in any case, you'll see that we've got our nice round, inside our shader, we've got our round gradient, and you'll see that this is going to scale out from the center, so it's working in a three-dimensional direction. And we can change our texture projection to, say, this side, and it's going to shrink from that side, and or whatever the case may be. And this also, of course, will work really well with creating a noise. So now it's a 3D noise, and it'll actually affect it along those lines as well. So 3D noises work. We could increase that to, say, 500, maybe increase the contrast a little bit, and now it'll be affecting it. Oops, did I not increase that to 500? There we go. Of course, these are like we've just been doing this based on scale. If we go back to transform, and we don't need to see the preview, we can actually go to our custom thing here and then have it go up. So as these are being affected, they don't just scale; they go up, or maybe they scale on one direction. So now, based on the shader fall off, this is going to animate out that way. Pretty crazy. So that is shader fall off. I'll see you guys in the next video. Hi there, this is Chris Schmidt with more of the Transform 1.2 free update training. So, in this video, we are going to be talking about the custom tab. So why don't we jump right on in? I want to let's create a transform, and we need some geometry, of course. So I'm going to, let's actually keep it straightforward. I'm going to create a cube. Not super exciting, but it gets the job done. I'm going to give us 15 by 15 by 15 polygons. Maybe apply this white material onto that so we can see a little better. And of course, I got my display mode set so that we can see the polygons. I'm going to take this and throw it inside the transform, and by default, we have poly mode. We could do chunk mode as well. Honestly, whatever mode you want to be doing. But I'm going to leave it on poly mode. Poly mode is a fun new one. So by default, of course, we've got our animation, we got the bounding box set around it, everything's working perfectly, but we are set on the effect of transform, and we want to make our own. I'm going to click on effect, and I'm going to go to the very top and click custom. As soon as we go to custom, we're going to get our custom tab up here. So what do we got? Before we even get into the custom mode, let's see what we're dealing with here. What we're saying is we are transitioning out in a custom effect from the orientation of -x, which means starting from the left and going in. In fact, it's already there a little bit. We don't want any thickness. We have some movement, some rotation. We're saying it's scaling out to 0 by the end. We have a a big fall off and no randomness. So those are some important factors. So we're starting out, essentially everything's starting out at a, let's say each individual clone here is starting out at a position of 0, a rotation of 0, and a scale of 0. And by the end, and that's what the custom tab does, is what we're doing is telling it its end point. Where is this going? So where are we going? Well, by default, we kept it real simple. All we did is put a little bit of motion in Y by default. So what we have going on right now is it moves up on Y. So what if we don't want it to move on Y? Well, we can just zero that out. And what do we want it to do? Well, right now it's doing nothing but scaling to 0. Every individual chunk, every poly, every letter, whatever mode you're in, it's going to scale to 0. And that, of course, is due to our end scale here. Actually, yeah, I guess we'll leave it at that. We'll keep it transitioning out like that. But let's see what else we can do. Well, of course, we can set different positions. So as we transition in, we're going to see that the X is moving on positive X. We can go negative. So now as this passes through, it's going to break apart and fly that way. But there's so many things to keep in mind. Like even outside of this, like a custom mode it doesn't do anything without the transform tab. The transform tab, if we add a little bit of randomness in here, you'll see that these start breaking apart a little bit. So it's the same motion, the same endpoint, but the way they're getting there is going to be different. They transition very differently, and this is going to have more effect on the final animation, this randomness, than where we actually tell it to go in the end. In addition, this is transitioning like this, but if we shrink our fall off down smaller, maybe put more randomness in. Like, look, that's completely different again, the way it's getting yanked apart from here. If we have an even bigger fall off, like the whole thing's going to transition differently again. So keep that in mind as we're messing with these, that this is just the endpoint. These are how it gets there. So let's go back to our position. So right now, by default, we have just something happening on X, but let's zero that back out again. Look at some other settings. Here's rotation. I can say that I want each of these to have rotated 360 degrees on H. So now as this transitions, each one of those is going to rotate 360 degrees. We could go and add all 3 of these, and now they will all rotate in the exact same way, but they'll all rotate individually. So that's rotation. And then we've got scale. And now this scale is kind of secondary to the other scale. The other one's saying scale down to 0 by the end. But this can say, before you scale down, I want you to scale up. So what's going to happen is these all scale up, and that's actually kind of fighting against the complete scaling down, but these are going to then scale back down again. So now they stretch up on Y. Now we limited it to 10, but you can drag this up even higher, and now you'll see that each of these, based on their local coordinate, so these will scale out sideways as well, not just on Y. It's local Y is scaling, so that's going to explode upward, and now that's there's another effect. In addition to that, misclicked. So now those are scaling up. They could scale up, and they could. Let's not do this. Let's do this one. So let's say 90 degrees rotation. So now they scale and rotate. Pretty cool. And once again, we go back to our transform tab and add a little bit of randomness in there. So now these are going to look a little more chaotic as they're spinning out. Zero that back out again, though. Okay, so that's some scale. We could scale all of them up a whole bunch. And now every single poly is going to get bigger and then go to 0. You could also scale it down. So it's going to start out normal, and then you see that it's actually, like, even though they are uniformly scaling because of the end scale, it's scaling down on Y really quickly. Or we could maybe go up on Y and scale down on these others, and now it's going to pinch to be really tiny. So a lot of options, just combining those 3. So those are the basics. I'm going to zero all of this out, so now we have no motion. And next up is our randomness. So we can collapse that in or out if we want, but now we can add random end positions. So for instance, actually let's just drag in a little bit of random X. So now these are transitioning out, and we put so much that they can even go the opposite direction. Let's shrink this down a little bit so there isn't too much motion. Now the same animation as we drag in, they're moving in varied amounts. So these can get combined. I can say fly out that way, but also have more random variation. So now they're going to fly out to a random distance, but mostly it's moving. But there's also that little bit of random variation on top of it. If we had 0 random, you see that they're all kind of lined up. As we had the randomness, they spread out. Their final position has more, random potential. Let's zero that back out. Actually, zero everything. And now let's maybe add a little bit of randomness on all 3 of them. So now we have X, Y, and Z randomness. And now they can fly out in any direction, kind of float away a little bit. So this is starting to look a little bit like our effect dissolve. If we had a little bit of rotation, we would have kind of the dissolve effect, one of our presets. Now, in addition to that, these are kind of traveling towards a set end position. In fact, they are very much doing exactly that. If we go to our end scale and tell it to go to 100%, now you can see what's happening. When they get to their end of the animation, they just stop there. So they exist forever if they don't scale down to 0. So these are going to they're transitioning from their position to this end position. But we can make this more interesting by giving it some animation. If we drag in a little bit of animation, their end goal is constantly moving around a little bit, and we can keep on increasing this. And now they start getting quite wiggly, actually. And now their end position is constantly flying around, so they can't ever really reach an end goal. It's always animating. So even at the end, like if we had no animation, they'll just stop. Now they won't stop because their end position is always changing. So that's pretty fun. Next up is pretty straightforward. We got some random rotation. So now if we drag all these in, when they get to their end position, they are all randomly rotated. So those randomly rotate 360 for all of these. And now you see we just end up with this crazy rotation. And of course, we can animate that as well. So now their end rotation is constantly rotating, which means they'll never stop moving. Now, of course, all this stuff can get used in conjunction. So now what we're saying is their end position never goes away, and their rotation, these are too big. Little amounts go a long way. So now look, these are all flying around, and they'll never go away, and they'll just keep buzzing around. If we added more keyframes, let's add a lot more, make it 10 times as long, these will just keep flying around forever. And what's maybe not something you would necessarily think about right away, but these can be keyframed. Like, so this is all flying around like this forever, but eventually, like we could right here say, go to our, well, actually animate, changing this could make stuff jump around a lot. I'm not sure about that. Well, we could animate down their amounts, and they could eventually zero out. So lots of options there. I'm going to reset all these back to their default. And then we have random scale. So we can do like a bunch of random scale all over the place. If we drag all these up, it should look pretty crazy. Oh yeah, I forgot we made this super long. Set back to 72. So transitioning. Now you, once again, add this, like, use a light touch depending on what you're doing. But if we scale these down randomly, now these will get nice and tall. The other ones will get potentially skinnier. We could add some animation on top of that. And now it's going to transition in. And they're all constantly moving. And then we could say add in some random Y position. And we can have them spin around like that. So look at this effect that we're getting. This is crazy looking. Like, these are just based on the polygons that we have currently existing. And now if we go back here and set our end scale back to 0, you'll see our object has this really cool kind of dissolve look, flying out in all these different directions. Now, in addition to that, let's say that, we kind of want it looking like it's teleporting away. I've kind of got that effect, but, this is looking a little bit teleporty, but they're going down. I want them to also go up. So what we can say is, like, at the end point, let's have them move, not randomly move on Y, but let's just have them straight up move on Y. So they've got their randomness, but they're also being told to move towards the end. So now they go up, and actually that's quite a bit. So let's go a little bit lighter. But now you see that they're not moving down so much. They're just getting dragged up and disappearing. So pretty cool effect, I think. So there are tons of options of stuff to do inside of this tab. And then we got the velocity curve, which is how this effect is transitioning through. This is the animation that not the overall animation, but the animation any individual polygon is taking. So for instance, if we made this really long and then sharpen it, so now it's going to do almost nothing and then accelerate at the end. What we'll see here is, like, these are barely starting, and then suddenly each individual part will go zoom and fling away. but it's still evenly transitioning across. So this is the velocity curve is very different from our time remapping curve. But I think that pretty much covers everything we want to cover in the custom tab. There's a lot of potential there, and I love to see where that goes in the future. So really fun for making your own custom animations. So see you guys in the next video. Bye. Hi there, everybody. Chris Schmidt back with the next part of the Transform 1.2 training. We're going to be talking about the Advanced tab. We're going to be clicking all the buttons in there. So let's go ahead and create a transform. And what settings are we going to need to deal with? Let's create a cube, and we'll just add some normal subdivisions and change it as we go. I'm just going to set to 11 because that's quick to type. Transform, refresh, and it's on. So we are dealing with the Advanced tab. So what do we have in here? Well, the first two settings. Well, first of all, most of the time you shouldn't need to go in here. But second of all, let's click some buttons. So first of all, we have the maximum chunk limit and the low poly limit. We set these to what we thought were reasonable because it's entirely possible that you throw in an object and it's got so many. If you just take like a car model and you throw in transform, there might be so many polygons it just freezes. Like it just can't handle it. So we put in limits. So you can actually change the limits here by dragging these. These are what we thought were reasonable limits. But if you know it's a reasonable object and you got a really good machine, then you can always hit the Remove Limits checkbox. And of course it says, warning may cause long calculation times, and indeed it might. So if it gets really high, you can always click the Remove Limits button if you're confident your machine is powerful enough, and override our limitation there for when it yells at you. So next up are just a couple little information boxes. We have our bounding box dimensions. So this is how big your object is. So this one is 200 by 200 by 200. Whatever the object is you feed in, that's just outputting the size for you. The bounding box ratio. So it's 1 to 1 to 1. So they're all even. Nothing too fancy. On-screen feedback is just it yelling at you if you're... You know, when you hit refresh, or like when you hit full update, it says click refresh. That only shows up if you turn on the on-screen feedback, so you can hide that, so they'll never turn on. And then the last one is just our bounding box. Actually, there's another one. If we go to poly mode, let's actually go to poly mode, and I'm going to create a sphere. So instead of the cube, I'm going to delete that, put a sphere in, and I'm going to actually turn off render perfect. Important to do that, otherwise it won't work in transform. I'm going to hit refresh, and now we're in poly mode. But you see we get this bounding box, and this bounding box might be a pain. You don't want to see the bounding box. It gives you information that transform's working properly, but you might not want to see that. So you can turn off bounding box. And depending on what you're doing, like let's say, I'm not sure, but let's say you take all of transform and you throw it into a connect object. If you do that, it's going to include our bounding box, because that is some geometry that transform is sending back, even though it doesn't render. So you have to go to advanced and turn off bounding box, and now you just get your geometry, and now this connect object's welding it together. So it's just an option along those lines. And then there's one last problem that you can fix using this polyphong checkbox. It's a super specific circumstance, and I think it is when you're using poly mode and you add thickness. If I hit render, it's going to start looking really crazy. It's if you add thickness to poly mode, it looks really weird. So you have to actually turn off this polyphong checkbox, and then it'll look more normal. Like we don't have all those streaks happening as regularly that's seen. So yeah, pretty straightforward. That is the Advanced tab. So see you guys in the next one. Bye.
Hey, it's Nick from Grayscale Gorilla, and in this video I wanted to show you how to set up great looking textures using Transform and Supertext. So let's head on in here and let's set up an example. So in this case, we're going to use Transform and MoText. I'm going to drop the MoText in here and show you what usually happens when you texture, and some pitfalls you may see as you go on and how to fix them. So here we're just going to click refresh. And you can see obviously transform takes over, but let's add a texture. Let's add a cement texture. Let's turn off transform here. Add a cement texture to our MoText and just see what happens, right? So first of all, we have this nice kind of cracked cement texture. We add it to our MoText, which is always where you should add it, never to transform, always to the object that you're trying to transform. But you can see it's not applying correctly. So You may have seen this before. The easy fix for this is to just select this texture tag over here. And instead of UV mapping, which doesn't work so well with Motext, you want to use cubic mapping. So here we go. Now we have our cement texture on the front and on the tops and on the sides, and it should be projecting really well. Well, then let's go ahead and add transform and click refresh and see what happens. Well, as we animate, you're going to see the texture is slipping. You're going to see it really well on this R here. So the R has this nice crack coming down kind of through the middle here. Well, as we animate, you're going to see the texture does not stick to our Motext. And there's really no easy way to do this unless we bake it out and make it unprocedural, right? So this is where SuperText comes in. So SuperText comes with the latest version of Transform, and it's under your plugins. And let's just add SuperText. Let's put it in between the Transform and the Motext. And let's just turn off Transform for now and just deal with the text for now. So SuperText does a lot of things. You may have seen it break apart textures, break apart polygons, in other videos. But in this case, just by adding SuperText and just by putting the cement texture on SuperText, you're going to see a few things happen. First of all, is it allows you to automatically stick a texture. So now when we turn on Transform and we go to refresh, it's going to, we have to turn off cloner mode, go to existing parts mode. There we go. Okay, so now it's going to stick your textures automatically. So now you can see the difference. Now Transform is going to move our objects around and the textures will stick directly to it. So that's great. So SuperText fixes a lot of things. But let me show you something that also happens. So let's say you're using the new poly mode inside of Transform. You go in here and you say, I don't want our letters to animate. I want to, blow up all these little polygons. So you go to poly mode, you click refresh, and you get all the polygons going crazy. But you hit render, and you go, what happened to our texture? It's all broken up into little pieces and parts and all this stuff. Well, polygon breaking things up into polygons by default kind of screw up a lot of the UVs, and so SuperText fixes that too. So what it does is it temporarily bakes out a version of SuperText that you can then use with polygons, and then allows you to quickly clear that bake and clear that cache and then update your Motext. So let me show you how that works. All you have to do is go into SuperText, click Super Bake, and now hit render, and now your textures are all set to go, and everything is stuck to each individual polygon. So as it breaks apart, the texture is going to stick directly to it, and for all your polygon stuff, it's going to be great. So what happens if you want to make a change? Well, all you have to do, is go to your Motext and make a change. So I could say, yeah, right? But you can see it didn't update because this SuperText is currently in clear cache or in Super Bake mode. So all we have to do is clear the cache, and you can see it's back, but now we have the weird textures, right? So now all we have to do is say Super Bake. Okay, and now everything's all set up. All the textures are back, and we're ready to go. So again, we try to keep things as parametric as possible. And so even though we do have to temporarily bake this out, we want to make it really easy to make changes. Boom, clear it, make a change, come back into SuperText, Super Bake. And so that's a little bit of trying to make your textures stick. Also, if you ever end up with bubbly type and you don't want bubbly type, sometimes this happens if you're using chunk mode or if you're using existing parts mode, things get really rounded. In this case, it turned out pretty good. But if you ever have little issues, it's always the Phong tag. Always look at the Phong tag and lower this number until things get flatter. So we'll go through more depth into that, into some tutorials we have planned for Grayscale Gorilla to really show you how to use Transform in specific projects. But in this case, just a quick video to show you how to make sure your textures look great using Transform and SuperText. Thanks for watching. We have tons of new training videos over on the site. Please check those out and learn more about Transform. And for now, I'll see you guys in another video really soon. Have a good one. Bye, everybody.
Hi there, everybody. Chris Schmidt back with Transform 1.2 training, and we've got a very specific but important video for this one. What we're going to talk about is baking out Transform for if you're sending something across Team Render or Net Render or, I don't know, any reason you might need to bake it. So, what do we do? Well, I'm going to create, say, a figure. Let's do chunk mode this time. I'm going to create a figure, so there's material on there so we can see them a little better. And let's increase his his segments a little bit, up to 24. And I'm going to go to plugins, transform, and we've got transform. Cool, throw the figure inside. Let's hit refresh. Actually, let's go to chunk mode and then hit refresh. And now what do we got? Well, if I drag our timeline, you see that we have chunk mode, and he's nice and chunked up, and he's breaking apart. So cool. Now you want to send this over through NetRender or TeamRender or something like that. How do you go about baking it? Well, we actually allow access to the transform hierarchy for just such an occasion. So what you're actually going to do is go to your layers tab, and you're going to unhide under the layers tab, under Grayscale Gorilla. You're going to click the under M, which I don't know what M stands for, but anyway, this is the hierarchy button. If we turn that on, it's going to unhide a bunch of the parts that make transform. So what do we see here? Well, inside here, you will find the chunks section. And on there's actually already applied a bake tag, a MoGraph cache. So if you click on that and I hit bake, it is going to bake out all of Transform's animation and store it in that tag. So if I drag across, you see we still have our animation. But if we go back to Transform, and perhaps we can even hide our hierarchy again. If I go back to Transform, and let's change our effect. Let's change it to collapse. When I go and I drag across the animation, you see that we still have our baked animation there. So that is set. It should be ready to be sent over to other objects, or NetRender and things of that nature. Even if we turn it off and on, there we go. It's still baked, even with collapse turned on. So nice stored animation there. Yeah. So yeah, you get access to hierarchy. You can actually see the way we did some of these things. We got some fancy plans for the future. But in any case, this should cover the baking stuff pretty well. So thanks for watching.